Here's Dinesh D'Souza to get confused about what knowledge is.
And so I can't say nobody's been to the other side and communicated back. I can just say there's no reliable evidence for it, and I don't know what shape that evidence would take in order to demonstrate that.
Okay, I want to come back to that because that you've now made to me a very striking claim, namely that we should, I think you're saying, disbelieve all claims for which there is not sufficient evidence.
Yeah, and what constitutes sufficient evidence depends on a lot of factors, like how inconsistent the claim is with the evidence we do have, and the stakes of believing the claim. The more banal and low stakes the claim is, the less evidence is required.
So,
not just that we should take an agnostic position, but we should disbelieve them. That's two different things.
Oh, so if you mean disbelieve as in believe they are not true, that's the exact opposite of what I just said.
Okay.
What I said was we should believe things when there's evidence for it, and that is both the proposition that the supernatural is real and the proposition that the supernatural is not real.
Okay.
You can so agnosticism isn't some middle ground between believing X and believing not X. There is no middle ground. You are either convinced of X or you are not convinced of X. And I'm not convinced that the supernatural is real. That doesn't mean that I'm convinced that the supernatural isn't real.
I am convinced that the supernatural isn't real because not only is there a dearth of evidence for it, it doesn't even seem to have a clear definition. It seems to be synonymous with magical, which is equally ill-defined. A concept has to have a discernible definition before you can attach it to a referent that exists in reality.
It's kind of like if you go into a courtroom,
Okay.
I may have to say not guilty, even if I'm not convinced of innocence, because the burden of proof is on the claim of guilt. And so the people who say, I have good evidential warrant to believe in the supernatural, have adopted a burden of proof, and they have to meet it. And until they do, I am not convinced.
In order to carry a burden of proof, a person has to be trying to convince someone of something. I'm not trying to convince anyone that the supernatural isn't real, therefore I don't have to prove that it isn't real.
Okay, but let's be clear about what that burden of proof is, because I'm not saying I have definitive proof that God exists or these are his attributes. Here's what I'm saying. I'm saying I don't know if there is a God in the sense of no. I'd call myself a believer. Now, right away we distinguish between a believer and a knower.
You're not making a very convincing case, Dinesh. If you want to convince anyone that a God exists, you're not meeting your burden of proof.
Right?
Sure.
It's an important
Knowledge is a
distinction.
subset of belief.
I believe there's a place called Papua New Guinea because I trust maps and I've studied about it. But I know my brother. I wouldn't say I believe I have a brother because I know the guy. So knowledge.
Are you saying you don't know that there's a Papua New Guinea?
No, I'm saying I know it in the sense that I accept the authorities from which I learn about it.
Sure.
I trust it.
The claim that Papua New Guinea exists isn't very analogous to the claim that a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind exists. The claim that Papua New Guinea exists is coherent. There doesn't seem to be anything internally contradictory about the idea that such a place exists. Also, the testimonial evidence all seems perfectly consistent across many, many independent witnesses, and you can find countless photos and videos of it. That makes the claim that Papua New Guinea exists very credible even if you don't go there and see it for yourself. Nothing even remotely approaches that level of evidence with respect to the claim that a God exists.
Well,
And if I went
clarity,
there-
it's not just relying on authority, it's actual evidence. So
Multiple, coherent, mutually consistent, independent eyewitness accounts are far from proof, but they are still far better than simply trusting an authority.
you have a belief in a proposition.
Right.
Whether or not it qualifies as knowledge is a separate question because knowledge is a subset of belief. In philosophy, it would be justified true belief. I tend to use a more kind of colloquial because I'm a dilettante. I'm an uneducated oaf who just talks a lot. But if you have a proposition and you accept that it's true, that's all I mean when I say I believe it. You either accept it or you don't. If I say I know it, all we generally mean, all most people mean when they say I know something is that they really, 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 really believe it. They're talking about the confidence level that they have in that proposition that it is likely true.
This is true with respect to all synthetic claims that I say I know to be true. By synthetic claims, I mean claims that could hypothetically be false without incoherence. For example, I know the claim some bachelors are Peruvian to be true. It would be quite absurd for that statement to be false, but it wouldn't be outright impossible or incoherent for it to be false. However, there are also analytic claims, by which I mean claims that are true by definition, like all bachelors are unmarried. With respect to claims like that, I don't just really, really, really believe that they are true. I am incapable of understanding what it would even mean for them to be false.
And when we say I know something, generally we're saying I believe this to the extent that it would be worldview altering to discover it was wrong. And so I believe there's a Papua New Guinea. I would actually argue that I know, I have evidential warrant that there's a Papua New Guinea without actually ever having been there. This is, people used to do the, oh, well, you don't know there's an Australia. Well, I do now because I've been there. But even before I was there, I think that I had evidential warrant for it.
Yeah, but okay, I agree with that. And I know that there's a Papua New Guinea in that sense. Let's take a different example. Let's say I were to tell you I'm from India. Okay? You have no reason to doubt me. You probably believe I'm from India.
Yeah.
Now, you don't actually know that.
It depends on what you mean by know.
Well, are you 100% sure?
No. Is 100% certainty required for knowledge?
Not necessarily, but
I would
what's
agree.
your bar?
The idea that knowledge is justified true belief is a bit weird, because justified doesn't mean proven, so you could infer a belief from evidence that seems to point to that belief, but actually turns out to be coincidental. For example, if you meet a couple and learn that they have the same last name, you would be justified in inferring that they were married, and let's say they are married. But let's say that they both happen to be born with the same last name. Not all Smiths are related to each other, so sometimes one Smith ends up marrying another Smith. So if you came to the correct conclusion that this couple was married from the fact that they have the same last name, but that fact had nothing to do with the fact that they were married, you had a justified true belief, but did you really have knowledge? It seems like such a case would be more like a lucky guess. Alex O'Connor has a video about this issue that I'll link in the description.
So I don't think you can be 100% certain about anything,
Okay.
Which is why I abandon the notion of certainty, which is why when I talk about knowledge, I talk about it as a subset of belief and it is a confidence level. But also, I genuinely don't really, I'm unimpressed when someone says they know something, because we don't wait till we have knowledge to act. We act in accordance with our beliefs, and whether or not your belief rises to the level of knowledge doesn't change what your action's gonna be.
All right.
I think that's too binary a way of looking at it. Whether we act on a belief or not will depend in part on how confident we are in that belief, not just whether we think we know it or not. This is also an example of the stakes mattering with respect to what we're asked to believe. Urgency is also an issue. How much time do you have to gather information? What are the consequences of being mistaken? These factors are going to influence how credible we find a claim to be and how we are going to use the information the claim is conveying.
So let's sort of circle back to where I was going with the three big questions. And I think
We started with death.
you were in violent agreement that the cause, that we don't know, the cause of the universe, we don't know.
I don't believe that the universe could have had a cause, and not just because there's no evidence of a cause, but rather because I think it would be a contradiction to say that the universe has a cause. The universe is the space-time continuum. The beginning of the universe would be the beginning of time. You can't cause something to exist at a time when it already exists, and there was never a time when time, and thus the space-time continuum, didn't already exist.
Any prescribed purpose for our lives. We try to discover it, but we don't know it.
Well, what do you mean by prescribed purpose? Sometimes parents try to prescribe purposes for their children's lives. I wouldn't regard such purposes to be binding. The same is true if there is a God who made us for a purpose. I see no objective reason why we ought to adopt the purpose that God prescribes.
And we don't know what happens after death.
The place you go when you die is the same place a song goes when you stop singing it. Since the mind is an activity, when that activity ceases, it doesn't really make any sense to say that it goes somewhere. To say that it does seems incoherent to me. I don't understand what it would mean for anything like an afterlife to exist. That there's no afterlife looks to me to be an analytical claim whose negation would be contradictory, rather than a synthetic claim that I merely really believe is true.
Yeah, I'm not convinced that anything does, but I definitely would agree. We don't know.
Fair enough. Now, let me ask you this question. What do you do about belief when you are in exactly this position? If something is true, it would have tremendous implications. For example, you would concede that if there was life after death, that would greatly affect the way we think about life on Earth now.
I don't see how it would affect how I see life on Earth, because it would be like discovering that married bachelors were real. I wouldn't even know what it meant, therefore I wouldn't be able to compute how it would affect the rest of my beliefs.
It would.
Depending on what that life looked like.
And depending on whether or not anything in this life had any impact on that life.
Correct. But right.
Yes.
So let's just say if the religious narratives are correct, and there is some sort of cosmic justice in which, let's just say, the crimes that are the undiscovered crimes of this life have to be accounted for in a future life, we would probably have to start thinking about all the stuff that we get away with in private, because even though we escape human accounting, there would be some sort of presumably divine accounting. So in other words, all I'm trying to establish is that there's a relevance to these questions, even if we don't definitively know anything about them.
This is effectively Pascal's wager. We should believe in God because if he does exist, not believing in him will have dire consequences. But if he doesn't exist, nothing much of value is lost in living under a false belief that he exists. There are a few problems with this. One is that God presumably wouldn't be satisfied with you simply going through the motions of believing in him. He would probably want you to sincerely believe. Blaise Pascal claimed that if you go through the motions long enough, you can cultivate a sincere belief. Given that I don't understand what it would even mean for a God to exist, I doubt that I could cultivate such a belief, even if I went through the motions of practicing a religion. Additionally, as Shannon Q once pointed out, if we follow the logic of Pascal's wager, the religion which we should choose to believe is whichever religion has the most sadistic conception of hell. And it's not at all clear that Christianity fits that bill. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.